This episode of Keys to the Shop is brought to you by Prima Coffee. Whether it's espresso machines, manual brewing devices, or general coffee shop needs, they seek to pursue the most innovative coffee products, both domestic and abroad, to offer their customers. Find out more at prima-coffee.com. This is Keys to the Shop, episode 78, exploring green buying and sensory analysis with World Cup Tasters champion Amanda Juris. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFerio. I'm your host, and happy that you decided to join me today on the show. Hope you've been having a really fantastic week and had a great weekend. Just making a lot of good coffees and tasting a lot of good coffees. And today we're going to be talking about just that, tasting coffee. We're going to talk with Amanda Juris, who is a powerhouse taster, world champion, in fact. We're going to talk about sensory analysis and green buying and the role that plays in the chain of quality and the impact it has on our stores and what customers buy. So I'm really excited to present this to you today. Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor here at Keys to the Shop, and that, of course, is Prima Coffee. So Prima Coffee is a specialty coffee equipment supplier, and they're based out of Louisville, Kentucky. And from the beginning of their company, they've set out to make the best coffee brewing equipment available to the general public. Now, their focus in this is curating the best equipment to fit their customers' needs. Everything from grinders to espresso machines to under-counter refrigeration. If you need something in the commercial category of equipment or something for your home, you want to build a really nice bar in your home, Prima Coffee has you covered. Just go to prima-coffee.com and see what they have to offer, and I'm sure you're going to find something that you're going to love. They have a lot of resources on the website as well, videos, blog articles, all talking about how to best use this equipment and exploring the world of coffee a little bit more. They put a huge emphasis on having the expertise to help their customers get the right gear to fit every situation. So I definitely recommend you go and check out prima-coffee.com, see what they can do for you. I've been using them for years, and I've always been happy with the service and the quality of my experience. So a big thank you to Prima Coffee for their support of Keys to the Shop. Now, I also want to mention, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Keys to the Shop. And if you've been listening for a while and you've been impacted by the content of the episodes and our guests, and it's helped you in your career or your cafe, would you consider leaving a review and a rating on iTunes? It really helps the show get out in front of more people and helps the show's visibility. And I just love hearing how the show has impacted you. Here's a review from Pauline Wells on iTunes. Pauline says, I heard about this podcast from a barista group on Facebook, and boy, am I glad I did. I am opening a new shop here in Denver, Colorado in 2018, and this podcast has been invaluable so far. I am taking the time to listen to every single episode, and I am continually amazed as I go. Chris, this is an incredible service/resource you provide. It is helping so much as I plan my shop in all aspects. Keep up the great work, man. Pauline, thank you so much for the kind words on iTunes. I really appreciate it. It's one of the goals for this show to be able to provide inspiration, like you say, in every episode, and provide instruction and equip people to do great work in specialty coffee and to move themselves in the industry forward. So the fact that this is helping so much in your coffee shop endeavors is hugely meaningful to me. So thank you very much for that. And I happen to know that Pauline and her husband Kyle are getting ready to open that store that she was talking about in the review very soon. I don't think that there is a open date. I could be wrong about that, but it's Torpedo Coffee in Denver, Colorado, at torpedocoffee.com, or on Instagram. You can follow the progress of their space at Torpedo Coffee. So best of luck to you two. And things look pretty good from the Instagram account. So yeah, awesome stuff. So today we are talking about sensory analysis of coffee. We're talking about green buying. And we are joined by none other than the 2014 U.S. and World Cup Tasters champion, Amanda Juris. Now, Amanda has been in the industry a long time. She was a green coffee quality specialist at Starbucks out in Seattle. She then became the director of coffee and green buyer over at Verve in Santa Cruz and is now a coffee trader with Keurig Green Mountain. Now, these roles are pretty heavy roles. They have a lot of sway and influence over a lot of coffee. And your palate has to be pretty dialed in to be able to have people trust you with containers of coffee. And Amanda is one such person, of course. She is the 2014 U.S. and World Cup Tasters champion. Now, in this conversation, we get to talk with Amanda about her process in evaluating coffees. What is it like to cup hundreds of coffees a day? What are you looking for? What is the process? What kind of descriptions are being used? And how do those descriptions that get written down by those evaluating the coffee translate into what we see on the bags on the shelf, and then how the customer perceives specialty coffee? Amanda sheds a good amount of light on the subject, so it's pretty great. And, we also talk about what you can do in your cafe and in your operation to have a more solid sensory analysis program, more solid cupping protocols, things like that. So here now is my conversation with Amanda Juris, all about green buying and sensory analysis. Well, hello, Amanda, and welcome to Keys to the Shop. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm just great. How are things over there in Europe? Where are you again?
I currently live in Switzerland now,
Ooh.
And it's good. We had a really cold week last week, but now it's almost spring here, so
very cool.
Can't complain.
I am just fascinated by your career, and I'm fascinated by this aspect of the industry that we're talking about today because I have never been involved in it. And so many of us who work in retail are just wondering about the details of, green buying and sensory analysis and all of that. But as most of us, you started in the retail side of things. How did you come up in coffee and then go from that to being focused on the green buying and sensory analysis aspect of the industry?
Sure. I started almost 11 years ago as a barista at Starbucks in the Seattle area. Now, the fact that I started out and kind of grew up in coffee in the Seattle area, I think helped out with things because after about 4 years in retail at Starbucks and working on some kind of high-end retail concepts for them, I was able to move into work in a role supporting an engineering team, actually, which I don't have any engineering background for the record. An engineering team internal to Starbucks, which most people are familiar with for having invented the Clover, which Starbucks acquired. So 4 years in retail with Starbucks, about 2 years working with coffee robots. And that's what, long story short, but I'm sure we'll make this a less short story. That's what ultimately was my segue into green coffee quality at Starbucks. And for me there, it really had to do with familiarizing myself in and out, up and down with the flavor profile of Starbucks coffees from a production standpoint, but also from a raw material standpoint. And cupping every day, which is what I did in tasting when I was working with the quote unquote robots, is what tailored me for moving into working specifically with green coffee.
I've heard stories, but how many coffees are you tasting a day when you're working out there, just getting to know Starbucks coffee? And you're cupping daily, but it's not like the way that some of us cup maybe, 6 to 10 coffees.
Yeah, well, cupping, first of all, dates back to the, I think, late 1800s, the 1880s. It was first pioneered, I believe, by Hills Brothers, and it's the industry standard way of evaluating green coffee quality. And all coffee contracts, the way coffee is purchased at origin, usually have some language in them around the quality of the coffee. So luckily for people like me, humans need to be involved at some point of the process to make sure that the contracts are met.
Mm-hmm.
So in the case of work at Starbucks and all coffee roasters, really, when any container of coffee arrives, it needs to be tasted. And up until that point, it's tasted many times as well. But once a coffee arrives at the port, it needs to be tasted to make sure the contract was upheld and the expectations were delivered upon. So in the case of a large volume coffee roaster, I would taste about 300 cups of coffee a day, which was in that case representative of, 30 containers. And a container holds 40,000 pounds of coffee.
Wow. I mean, just putting myself in the position of getting to, I guess, taste that many coffees is really daunting. I mean, it's got to be physically taxing.
It definitely is. And when you start out in a role like that, cupping, there's no way you can go through 300 cups of coffee without having palate fatigue, probably very early on. It's similar to a muscle in that you just get comfortable with having that much coffee go through your mouth. But it's all spit out.
And you end up absorbing, some of it. So there's was there a method to survival in terms of knowing when it would hit? And in particular, certain types of coffees, did you have a choice of when to cup them because you knew that you were going to hit fatigue at 3:00 or something?
No, I think in this case, my regular routine was going into work around 6:30 a.m. There was a good reason for that. And we would cup 300 cups of coffee and be done around 10:30 a.m. And I wouldn't typically eat or even drink much besides coffee up until that point. And that was just because, one, I was lazy in the morning and didn't leave myself time to make breakfast at home. And anything between when you start and stop cupping, you have to go through a process of recalibration. So even water, I felt like I had to re-season my mouth to coffee at the end.
So I'm picturing this routine, and it sounds, I'm going to be honest, it just sounds monotonous. What is it that, first of all, I mean, was there times when you missed retail?
There are aspects of retail that I definitely loved and still miss to this day, especially around customers I was able to interact with and became friends with. But I don't know, I think some of us just really geek out about tasting things, and not just coffee, but food and wine. And I like cooking, and I can honestly say that every single day that I worked in that job, I tasted something new. Whether it was good or bad. I mean, you taste defects in coffee and they taste like chemicals and rotten fruit. That's not always pleasant, but I think for somebody who's kind of a food and flavor geek like me, that was always interesting, and that kept the job interesting.
So it's interesting and not just off-putting, because we could taste some defect on the cupping table and just be really put off by it and use all sorts of superlative language to just bash it, just really awful coffee. But it piques your interest because it's, something you can have an effect on. Like, you're a decision maker in this process, and you get to, thumbs up, thumbs down to a particular lot, or, what kind, is that kind of where your mind was when you're thinking about how interesting this coffee is?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, interesting's maybe not the word in describing the coffee with defects, but I think even when you're cupping with the consumer who doesn't like the flavor of things that taste like pool water or fertilizer, but even when you can show them the range of what coffee can taste like, even if it's a defect, most people are usually pretty surprised and in a way intrigued about this range of flavors and the work it takes to control the quality of coffee.
So when you're cupping the coffees and you're picking up defects and you're picking up flavors, you mentioned earlier that your role in a way is to uphold a particular set of expectations in a contract, partially, or how does that work? Are you looking for a particular number of defects? Does it just depend on the contract or the coffee?
In a very black and white way, it does depend on the contract. Contracts have language in them around defects that are available, the screen size, which doesn't necessarily affect the cup profile. They have language around the SCA cup score, and then specific flavor attributes that might be present. For example, a contract for an Ethiopian coffee might require that it's 86 points or above, but it's probably also going to have some language about the florality and citrus flavors present, because if those aren't there, even if it's an 86-point coffee, it's just not an Ethiopian coffee. So every contract's different. Some are less demanding than others, and don't ask for more. Maybe it's an 82-point coffee. And in a very black and white way, yes, it's just to make sure that coffee tastes exactly like what it was contracted to taste like.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you're doing this is the first stage, I'm guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also cupping and tasting that affects how a coffee is described, or the potential of how a coffee is described to the consumer. Where does that come into this process of assessing a coffee?
Sure. There are many places, first of all, that cupping's used in the supply chain. Cupping's used by pretty much everybody who exchanges money with coffee along the supply chain. So that includes farmers, that includes many times millers, if that's applicable, exporters, importers, roasters, and then different levels of kind of the coffee roasting side. Everybody's looking for a specific thing, but usually it traces somehow back to what somebody at the next level is going to pay for the product. In my role as a green coffee buyer and director of coffee, I was responsible for sourcing the coffee, creating those expectations for a certain coffee purchase, evaluating those upon arrival, and then creating tasting notes that would follow the coffee all the way to a consumer's home.
Because they're the one purchasing the coffee next in the supply chain.
Yeah, it's next in the supply chain after the green coffee buyer buys and receives and launches the coffee is the barista, who's in charge of kind of continuing to tell the story of that coffee. And finally, the consumer, who has to also have an expectation for what that coffee is supposed to taste like when they brew it at home. In a lot of ways, I, like the person before me in the supply chain, am creating a set of expectations that needs to be upheld for that consumer in their home. Even if that set of expectations isn't a complicated green coffee contract, it's just 3 flavor descriptors.
So when you set the expectations for a coffee, when you're the next person in the supply chain, it's the same when a customer is getting a coffee in the store. That set of expectations is similar to how the relationship works between you and an exporter and a farmer, et cetera, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, even you and me, we're coffee customers, and oftentimes we go on another roaster's website and they're advertising this coffee and it looks amazing the way they're describing it, and we buy it and brew it at home. And we're hoping to have the experience that they described, whether it's a geisha and it's going to taste like florals and we paid $50 a pound for it. And if it doesn't taste like that, I mean, there's times when the customers come back to the shop and they say, hey, you advertised this and I didn't experience that. Now, We both know there's a lot of variables in brewing coffee and we won't go down that road, but it's very similar. It's very similar evaluating green coffee on offer, on pre-shipment, on arrival. If there's an expectation around it, especially when price is involved, that feedback needs to go back down the supply chain.
Do the descriptions get narrower and more specific as you get closer to the consumer?
Yes, and that has to do with many reasons, one of which being how much space there is on a label to write about coffee. But I would say, the cupping notes I assign to a coffee when I taste it at pre-shipment or offer phase are probably a lot more wordy than the 3 words I write on a bag to describe a coffee.
So yeah, let's talk about that, because there's a methodology. You're not just, sipping coffee and say, well, I think this tastes like cauliflower and jasmine, which sounds horrible. But yeah, what is the methodology that you use or have come to use in assessing a coffee?
Well, I'm glad you use those words as descriptors, because it's true. I think the way we award coffee, giving the scoring system, the SCA cupping protocol, is really the most complex coffees are the only ones that stand a chance at scoring the highest scores. You can have very nice, clean, acidic, balanced coffees, and they can be great, but they're probably never going to be 90, 92-point coffees. So usually when we get excited about a coffee, maybe because we're geeks, we're even excited about a cauliflower flavor in that, we're going to write all those things down. That's how we score and analyze coffee. But when it comes to the consumer, I try and narrow it down a little bit. So, and consumers have different tastes. I mean, some of them put milk in their coffee and some of them want something that's more chocolatey. And I try and really write those tasting descriptors to help that coffee find its match in the end consumer. A coffee consumer like me is probably going to look for coffee that's advertising a lot of complexity, tropical fruits, berries, citrus, florals. But I know there's a lot of customers out there that would rather have butterscotch and cookie dough and milk chocolate and fudge.
Wow.
So
I do. I want that.
You want that. So given I only have about 3 words I can write on a bag to describe a coffee, I try and pick those words really wisely. So if a coffee is going to cost more, if it has the complexity to earn that price tag, I want to make sure that those words jump out to a customer like me who wants those flavors in a coffee. Whereas if it's just a more balanced, everyday drinker, brew it in a bun dripper, I'm probably going to not try and scare away any customers, for one, but also not try and put any words on it that are going to attract that crazy coffee consumer like me. So if that's the case, again, nice coffee, but not as complex, not as crazy, not as expensive, I'll trim down those words to make them more accessible to hopefully connect it with the person who wants that coffee.
Oh, that's wise. I mean, it's psychology. It's a little bit of consumer psychology there. How much does the customer's preference weigh in, and how do you know what the customer's preference is when you come into the situation as a green buyer, as somebody assessing this coffee? How do you know what, John or Mary? I have no idea why you use John or Mary. It's like, but these customers have preferences. How do you come into that knowledge?
Most cases you don't, as the green coffee buyer. But I think whose preference is the most important is the baristas. And my most recent role, Verve Coffee Roasters, we had 9, 10 cafes now that served our coffee. And there was no way that I had any chance of meeting even a representative sampling size of all the customers out there. But if I could get the baristas excited about a coffee, then it would be a hit with the customers, because the baristas are, at the end of the day, the best form of communication for messaging a coffee and telling that story. And if they're excited about it and they're on board with the way the coffee's described and the value proposition relative to the way the coffee's priced, then it'll be a hit. That I could be sure of.
So they're shaping public opinion about the offerings in the store.
Absolutely.
So the average coffee, something that's just a easy drinker, lower price tag, might not be something that the barista is totally excited about, but the one that's just like really complex, using very specific language and higher price point, might be the one that's going to be talked about a lot. Yeah.
I think the everyday drinker, quick cup of coffee, maybe isn't the one that the baristas are going to be advertising first off, but they know where it is and they know it's there and that they know there's a customer for that.
Mm-hmm.
And a customer will come in looking for a coffee. They'll tell them they drink it with cream and sugar, and the barista will go directly to that. But if a customer comes in and says, what's your favorite? Yeah, typically just like me, just in my experience coming up with coffee and getting excited about coffee, but also wine and beer and spirits, every time I tasted something new and kind of made that connection, it was exciting. That's what kept me engaged. Again, even if it was a coffee defect. And I think that's true with a lot of people and a lot of baristas, because I think the coffee community and the barista community is just a curious group who likes things that taste good. So if I had a complex coffee that had clear, obvious, intense, and complex flavors, I could get the baristas rallied around that, and it would be a hit.
So going back to cupping and the idea of getting inputs from the next chain in the value chain, the next hands to touch the coffee, the baristas, because there's turnover in specialty coffee retail, unfortunately, there's going to be changing palettes and, there's training and things like that. But what are some more inputs that really help shape what you're looking for as a green buyer and cupper? More feedback that you get? Does it, from the consumer, the owners? Do different companies just have to set out a set of values around flavors that they prioritize?
That's a good question. I think, first of all, another way to make sure the right coffee gets linked with the right customer that wants that coffee is in the way that it's commercialized and made accessible to them. So obviously this means not putting complex Kenyas and geishas on the brew queue, quick cup, batch brew, whatever the word is everybody uses.
Yeah.
And making those available as a more up-leveled pour over single cup, one way or another product. And then again, for the coffees that are batch brew, maybe making those a little bit more accessible. I mean, at the end of the day, it is tough. There weren't many ways that I had the opportunity to communicate with customers. So between the few words I got to put on the bag descriptors and the short paragraph maybe I got to write about the origin story, and the baristas who I hoped sort of retold that story well, I just had to sort of push coffees out into the wild and hope they found happy homes.
I mean, there's a tension there because you want satisfied customers, happy customers, and you want also to facilitate the success of those who produce the coffee that is being sold. So, I mean, given that tension, how do you manage that with knowing that, you've got to sell this coffee. You've got buyers that are depending on you to look into these contracts, or you're needing to cup this coffee and sell it to the consumer, but you also want to be helpful to the farmer and those who have gone before. How do you manage that tension kind of in between as a cupper and green buyer?
Well, as the cupper and green buyer, yes, you have to honor the farmer and everything that and the exporter and the importer and everything that they've done to get the coffee to you. And then you also have to facilitate a clientele that appreciates that as well and is willing to pay for that. And you're in this middle ground where you buy coffees and then they go on a container ship and they land, and hopefully they land the way they tasted a few months ago in origin. And then you have to set a price for the coffees and roast them and sell them to consumers on the other end. And I've always believed and stood by that it's absolutely paramount to garner the trust of the baristas and the consumers. Because as soon as that's eroded, as soon as they feel like you're just making up words and putting them on a bag and trying to sell them stuff, I don't think you can continue to tell the story the way you hope to and continue to create the audience that you want. So it's tough. You're in a tough position as a green coffee buyer because sometimes you pay a lot of money for coffees. You work with a farmer to maybe develop something and you're committed to purchasing their coffee. And it doesn't land the way you hoped it would. And you have to make a decision at some point. And whatever that was, if you have to forego promoting and advertising and making a fancy product out of this coffee for 1 year and use it as a blend, I think it's more important to do that than to risk eroding the trust of your customers and baristas.
What's the consequence of eroding trust?
I mean, you don't want to be with the boy who cried wolf, because you want to have every time the ability to connect with the customers, to have them read your 3 taste descriptors on the bag and taste the coffee and say, wow, that's exactly that. That's exactly what I expected it to be. And you created those expectations. And once they get home with a coffee and taste it and it doesn't demonstrate that, then you risk them not believing anything else you write or try to tell them.
They ask for it too. I was just thinking that it'd be so much easier just to sell the coffee and say, oh, you'll see. But every time, I just got off a shift here, at Quills in Louisville, and people ask questions. What does this coffee taste like? And you have to answer that.
Yeah.
So it better be good. And the customer is going to determine the fate. Not to be too heavy about it, but I imagine that eroding the trust of the consumer also damages everything else downstream of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's all about creating long-term loyal customers, and I think trust is one of the first critical aspects of that.
So now I want to talk about what we can do to make a difference in our own efforts to analyze coffee, communicate well, and help build that trust in our operations. So many of us have labs and, cupping tables and things like that. I would say most. So if we want to establish the best possible quality sensory analysis system for our shops, what would you say are some of the top essentials that we need to have in place to make sure that we're just right on the money?
I think first, there's the lab and the equipment you have and the infrastructure around how to taste coffee and evaluate coffee. I think it's also very, very important to realize the importance of water and the other sort of fundamentals of brewing coffee around the way a coffee is going to taste. It's paramount for everybody to do their due diligence about the water they're brewing their coffee with, because that's going to totally change the experience. And we know, unfortunately, that not everybody at home does that. But if at least we control that and we can tell people what we're doing about the water we're using to evaluate our coffee, they have a small chance of achieving the same thing at home. But I won't go into brewing parameters. So do your due diligence to make sure your lab's set up, you're doing it right. It's going to be very hard to frame expectations and tell people how to brew your coffee if you don't actually have all those parameters nailed down yourselves. After that, after we've made sure we're doing a good job cupping and evaluating our coffee, also making sure we've taken into consideration how other people, the people before us in the supply chain, are evaluating their coffee, so we can take everything with necessary grains of salt, if applicable. I think the next most important thing is to build a little bit of flexibility into your business model so that you don't put yourself in a position where you're putting all your eggs in one basket on a certain coffee that you had really planned on selling at a really high price and getting everybody excited about, and then having it not land well. It's really important to have that flexibility in your business model so that you don't put yourself in a position of lying to your customers. And as a coffee buyer, it sucks. It sucks to buy a coffee that you're really excited about and paid a lot of money for, and then a few months later, it just doesn't taste like that at all. But you don't want to have to put that burden on your customers.
You're talking about blends or other avenues of, I don't know what else, honestly. Like, what besides blends? I mean, what else can we do?
Well, first of all, blends aren't a bad thing, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm saying that, but blends have a flavor profile too, and customers buy blends hope they taste the same way year in, year out. So again, we can't mess with blends too much, but maybe there is a way that you have a coffee and you can blend it in, sadly, at a small percentage without compromising the flavor of the blend, but without lying to customers about the coffee. I think that's the extreme situation, though. But maybe just it's a matter of not selling it at the price you thought you would.
Yeah.
So really knowing also kind of a pricing structure, and this takes just analyzing your consumers and what they're willing to pay for a cup of coffee and what they're willing to pay for the best cup of coffee. And we buy things sometimes and think they're going to be winners and going to garner that level of enthusiasm. But we have to be realistic with ourselves when they end up not being so. And we have to have the flexibility to maybe not be able to charge as much for that cup of coffee and maybe go through it a little bit quicker by using it as a batch brew coffee.
Great point. And so now that we have that, I think the next question on my mind, and I think probably many of our minds, is how do we, in your opinion, because you're just, we've got so much experience and are so skilled in this area, how do we develop our skills to be able to taste better, to build that trust? Because, it's not something that we just walk into a cupping room and are automatically good at.
No, not at all. And I think there's two parts to it. First, there is being good at tasting things. And I don't think it's actually that hard. I think a lot of people are afraid. I get a lot of people telling me, "Oh, I don't think I could ever do that." And I don't think that's necessarily true unless you've been diagnosed with something that certifies that your sensory skills are not up to par. I think most people with enough practice and enough kind of patience and inquisitiveness can be good cuppers. And I've trained a lot of people who I've seen that happen in. So I think there's first being good at tasting things and having a general interest and inquisitiveness about tasting and learning about it. It doesn't have to be coffee. It can be steak. It can be wine. As long as you care and care to ask questions about it, I think you're off to the right track. And then I think the next part, and this is the one where I think people get confused or have the wrong idea around sometime, is being a good cupper in coffee is first and foremost, well, after being able to taste, is being able to calibrate. So I think some of us have the ability and the vocabulary to taste something and just start rattling off descriptors of things they taste. But a lot of times that overcomplicates things. And there's a time and place for that. Maybe when you're evaluating an offer or a coffee sample for the first time and you're, again, scoring that complexity to try and determine what the maximum sort of score and capability of that coffee is. But when it comes to providing feedback, whether it's down the supply chain to a farmer or an exporter, especially if it's one who speaks a different language, or up the supply chain to a consumer, it's really about calibration and being able to be flexible with your vocabulary to speak the same language about everybody else when it comes to describing a coffee. And that part's tough because that really can't happen without somebody else with whom to calibrate with. And that's why if you're really serious about becoming a cupper, programs like the Q Grader certification are good, not because you're going to get a job offer right away, but because it's really hard to measure your ability to calibrate with somebody unless you have somebody to calibrate with. And I think the most important thing about people who hold a Q Grader certification is it's a stamp on their resume of their ability to calibrate their cupping language and scoring ability with people around them, people that they might be writing a contract with or doing business with.
Huh. Interesting. For those of us cupping with other people in our cupping labs, our managers, our baristas, or even our customers, does that count?
In terms of calibration,
Mm-hmm.
I think yes. I mean, in a lot of cases, not everybody has the opportunity to calibrate with somebody who is a cupper, but if you can calibrate with just somebody and you cup with them one day, maybe on that first day you're not using the same languages to describe things, even if you're both at about the same level when it comes to evaluating coffee, and then you rejoin them a week later and hopefully maybe you're starting to use some of the same words, that's calibration, and that's important.
So you want a team of people really that are going to be consistently coming to the cupping table that will be calibrated together and not necessarily introducing a bunch of new faces each time.
Absolutely. And I think that's important even in any cupping lab. Everybody has bad days. Everybody has days where they didn't sleep enough the night before, or they're starting to get a cold and they don't quite know it yet and their palate's off. And you have to have that data point to compare yourself to, or else you're making important decisions based on an instrument of yours that you don't know if it's in calibration or not.
Right. Depending on your breakfast, whatever it was.
Yeah.
We always would joke we should each take the most common breakfast and individually take it on and eat it and see how our coffee tastes. After the mint, after the burrito. Anyway, not something that Amanda would recommend. But just calibration with other people. And what else can we do to develop our palates?
Really, like I said, it's just about tasting everything you possibly can. I mean, that's how I did it, at least. I was curious about coffee. I started attending cuppings that other roasters were holding. I learned how to conduct them myself. Every time a new coffee came out, I would try it in as many brew methods as possible, take notes, compare the differences. Also cupping blind. It's easy to sort of drink your own Kool-Aid and convince yourself you're tasting something, especially if it's written on the bag. It's really easy to just sort of assume that's right, but sometimes it's not right. Hopefully it is, especially if I'm the one writing the tasting notes. But sometimes that's not right. So setting up blind cupping, setting up triangulations, trying to really fool yourself. And that's hard to do. But it's very, very important to really be objective when you're cupping coffee.
Removing that bias.
Yeah. And there were times when I'd be cupping with a colleague and say we had 3 cups and I thought one of them was a defect and my colleague didn't get it. I would have a colleague mix all the cups around when I'm not looking and then come back to it and try and pick out the one that I thought was the same defect, and not making a decision until that exercise had been gone through. And if I could find the same one, chances are it was a defect. And if I couldn't find it, then it was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. It does that a lot.
Huh. I get the feeling that not everybody does that. Maybe too many people maybe trust the first flavor that they taste, or wouldn't necessarily put themselves through another whole process of cupping because it's a lot of work and we've already been here for so long.
Well, I don't want to sound contradictory, but it is important to trust your first instinct. And that was something a lot of people asked me in after Cup Tasters Championships because I tended to go through pretty quickly and make decisions pretty fast. And I really firmly believed that the first time or the first few times you taste a coffee are when your palate's the strongest. So you're better off to just go with your first instinct, maybe check your work once, than to go over it again and again and again. Because every time you do, you get a little bit more fatigued. So I do think it's important to trust your first instinct. But if you're having a debate on the cupping table about whether one cup's off, I think that's a good exercise to really kind of do a sanity check, is to have somebody mix them up and go back and look for the defect again.
Nice. And that can only help build more trust.
Exactly.
Nice. So this has been a great conversation. I'm really liking where we're going with this. I know it's really going to be valuable for some people setting up their labs right now, trying to figure out their processes of, who to have on their cupping team and how they can, earn the trust of their baristas and customers and themselves and their palate. Final words to us from a grain buyer, from a cupper, like what is at stake here? And the role of tasting a coffee, just tasting it, sounds very simple, but it's not so simple, is it? Lives are on. I don't sound too deep here, but lives are on the line, the livelihood of our industry and people involved, huh?
Yeah. I think as a cupper or a green coffee buyer, you have a lot of responsibility in making purchasing decisions about coffee, which sometimes cost a lot of money. Again, a container's 40,000 pounds of coffee times a few dollars. That's significant. However, you're in a role where you have to kind of earn that money back for the company you're working for or for your own company. And that's why I think the most important thing, as I've said again, is that trust, is finding a coffee from a farmer and purchasing it and then matching it, like a matchmaker, with a customer on the other end. And that could be a customer who wants a really fancy coffee like me, or it could be a customer who just wants a coffee that's going to taste the same every day, and it's going to have those kind of comfort food aspects of a coffee. And both of those things are okay, but knowing your clientele and knowing kind of where the coffee comes from and making it as easy for that customer to find that coffee, that's the most sustainable supply chain, because you'll probably be able to purchase that coffee next year if you did a good job finding the customer to purchase it on the other end. And I think that's the most important part.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda, for taking time to explain all this to us. And I just hope that this helps us build a more trustworthy industry. And I know that I'm really just thankful for your wisdom and helping us at Keys to the Shop. This is definitely one of the keys to the shop.
Well, thanks for having me.
There are so many different types of palates and customers out there who like what they like. They might like a coffee that we don't. They might find it interesting where we don't find it interesting. It seems to me that accuracy and knowing your customers and having this kind of a good feedback loop between what's being sought after and what's being offered is how we make progress in our industry and continually improving our palates in our programs in our shops to be able to earn the trust of the baristas who are selling the coffees to customers and the trust of the customer who is reading these bags and these descriptions that we're using. It's no small thing. Each little bit counts. Every decision. I just think about how millions of decisions are being made right now in customers' minds across the world that will affect the market in major ways. So anything we can do as individuals and as shops collectively to make a more accurate and trustworthy environment of sensory analysis and communication of flavor to a customer is going to be a great stride forward for specialty coffee. So I hope that you take Amanda's advice and apply it to your cafe in the program that you have in place to evaluate coffees for your shop and also to your personal palate development. Just learning more about tasting and becoming more accurate and more confident. So my thanks to Amanda for joining us on the show, giving us her perspective on cupping coffee and sensory analysis. I think that was just amazing, and we appreciate you, Amanda. Thank you so much. Now, if you want more information about Keys to the Shop, you can go to keystotheshop.com. All of our past episodes are on that website, as well as an opportunity to put your email into a little box that'll pop up when you're there. And if you do that, you'll be signed up to receive a weekly newsletter or weekly email that has the show notes from the most recent episode in it. So if you want the highlights from this episode with Amanda, and you can sign up for that email newsletter, and that will be sent to your inbox along with the links of different companies and books or resources mentioned in the conversation, as well as some news about Keys to the Shop here and there as things come up. And speaking of news, Keys to the Shop, me, is going to be over in Baltimore at Coffee Fest this coming weekend. If you haven't been to Coffee Fest, it's worth checking out. You can go to coffeefest.com to find out more information about upcoming shows if you're not able to make it to Baltimore. Really great workshops and lectures, very affordable training. So if you are going to Baltimore, please do say hello, and I hope to see you in Denver and LA, which are the two Coffee Fests coming up after this. Now, if you want to reach out to me directly, you can do so by emailing Chris at keystotheshop.com. That's CHRIS at keystotheshop.com. If you have questions, comments, or feedback about the show, I'm all ears. I always love to hear from you. Or if you want to know what it might look like for Keys to the Shop to work with you in training and consultation for your cafe or your career, I would love to talk to you about that as well. It's something that Keys to the Shop is offering now, and I would be honored to be able to work with you to that end. So again, that's Chris at keystotheshop.com, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much for joining me and taking time out of your day to listen. I'm always honored by your investment of time and attention into the show, and I really appreciate you all. Just know that we couldn't do it without you. Whatever you're doing in coffee right now, be it large or small, you're making an impact. You are, and I appreciate you, and I appreciate your sacrifice and your contribution to specialty coffee. So thank you again, and as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.